Narrative types and recurring depictions. God gives the nuts, but he does not crack them. Franz Kafka. Sometimes when we think a teller is not getting the story right, it means that the storyteller is not telling the story we would prefer to be told, or that we think is being told. Digressions and misdirections may not be errors so much as the enactment of another story entirely, one that is being told, but one that we're not quite able to hear. Bruce Jackson, The Story is True, The Art and Meaning of Telling Stories, 2007. There's something they aren't telling us, something we don't know about. There's more to it. There's always more to it. This is what history consists of. It's the sum total of all the things they aren't telling us. David Ferry and Don DeLillo's Libra, 1988. By the time of his indictment on April 27, 1995, Timothy McVeigh had already been depicted as a demon, a lone wolf or one of a pack, a CIA agent, an FBI informant, a patsy, government guinea pig, disgruntled soldier, fallen war hero, loser, loner, gun nut, and conspiracy theorist. In the chapters that follow, I examine the origins of all of these stories, compare several existing works about him to each other, and introduce new, never-before-published information, thereby offering a hidden biography of Timothy McVeigh. In many ways, this book is a story about stories, the people who tell stories, the stories they tell, and the reasons they tell them. Before telling McVeigh's backstory, I want to briefly outline 5 commonly told narrative variations: the lone wolf, the pack of wolves, the closely watched wolves, the guilty agent, and the experimental wolf. The Lone Wolf. The Lone Wolf narrative is the least complex and most widely known account of the Oklahoma City bombing, and the one officially endorsed by the U.S. government. In this story, McVeigh, alone, motivated by his anger over the federal government's actions at Waco, conceived of and executed the bombing plot. While his former Army buddy Terry Nichols provided minimal assistance by helping McVeigh gather components for the bomb and assisting to build it, he did so under duress, fearing for the life of his family, whom McVeigh threatened. Then McVeigh alone drove to Oklahoma City on the morning of April 19, 1995 to detonate it. Footnote: Lone wolf terrorism is a term used by experts, academics, watchdog organizations, and the media to denote a particular tactical strategy of political violence. Terrorism studies scholars have defined lone wolf terrorism as, quote, political violence perpetrated by individuals who act alone, who do not belong to an organized terrorist group or network, who act without the direct influence of a leader or hierarchy, and whose tactics and methods are conceived and directed by the individual without any direct outside command or direction. Others have conceived of the phenomena of lone wolf versus group terrorism, pack of wolves, as occurring within a spectrum, and argue that lone wolf terrorists, in the truest sense of the term, must meet the following criteria of loneness. 1. They self-radicalize. 2. They have no contact with other militants or belligerents. 3. They conceive of their act of violence alone with no influence, encouragement, or inspiration from any outside party. 4. They conduct all planning alone. 5. They receive no direct or indirect assistance or support. And 6. They execute all stages of their attack alone. The strategies of lone wolf resistance, sometimes called leaderless resistance, as defined, adopted, and popularized by the broader extreme right underground throughout the 1980s and early 1990s, were widely credited with informing McVeigh's own actions, and inspired the aspirations of subsequent lone wolves. End footnote. In lone wolf stories, all details of the plot and the identities, motives, movements, and actions of perpetrators are known. Additional, unapprehended accomplices and co-conspirators do not exist, and no stone has been left unturned, no mystery remains, and narrative closure is achieved. As with all the other narrative types, the lone wolf story originated with multiple individuals and institutions, and appeared prior to McVeigh's and Nichols' trials or convictions within news reports, biographical works, and in McVeigh's own letters and conversations with his defense team and reporters. Today, the lone wolf story is not only inscribed upon geographical locations, memorials, but also permanently embedded in consciousness and the collective national memory. While many McVeigh as lone wolf type accounts have been published, the most enduring and well-known of them, and the one that continues to inform expert academic and popular understandings of both the bombing and the man executed for it, is the one McVeigh himself narrated to Dan Herbeck and Lou Michel for their 2001 authorized biography, American Terrorist Timothy McVeigh and the Oklahoma City Bombing. According to the authors, despite the ongoing appearance of his leaked confessions in news reports, McVeigh's public silence about his exact role in the bombing left room for the proliferation of conspiracy theories. But unlike Lee Harvey Oswald, there was still a chance to let McVeigh tell his story. The authors wrote that by letting him do so, they hoped to circumvent the specter of unresolved issues that surrounded the JFK assassination. With the publication of American Terrorist, readers are told, McVeigh irrefutably, quote, becomes the confessed bomber of the Murrah building in OKC. McVeigh's motives for cooperating with the authors are more than a bit ironic. While readers learn of his lifelong fascination with conspiracy theories, McVeigh hoped to refute the conspiracy theories surrounding the bombing and himself, especially those propagated by his former attorney Stephen Jones. Therefore, McVeigh and the authors spend a considerable amount of time addressing competing accounts and theories and denying McVeigh's documented connections to other violent extremists, the existence of JD2 or 3 or 4, or any other related big conspiracy. According to Herbeck and Michel, McVeigh told them his story with such frank, quote, intensity and candor, held back nothing and provided, quote, a depth of detail that, quote, jibed with witness testimony and, quote, perfectly fit with the official accounts offered by the FBI investigators and prosecutors. They had no reason to question his honesty and wholeheartedly believed the story he orated. Aggressively asserting the role of lone wolf mastermind bomber to his official biographers, McVeigh claimed to have carefully planned his actions down to the tiniest minutia, including the John Wilkes Booth t-shirt he wore the morning of the bombing. He said he hoped the bombing would act as a, quote, shot heard around the world, which would inspire and catalyze other revolutionary acts. Footnote: American Terrorist continues to be the foremost book cited about McVeigh and the bombing. Brandon Stickney's 1996 book, All-American Monster, the unauthorized biography of Timothy McVeigh, was written and released prior to the start of McVeigh's trial. Stickney hailed from the same region as McVeigh and worked as a reporter for the Lockport Union Sun and Journal, a small local newspaper that published McVeigh's provocative letters to the editor prior to the bombing. To write his book, Stickney compiled a lengthy and extensive bibliography of existing media accounts and helped to establish a narrative chronology and structural template used by many subsequent works. Stickney's interviews exposed a handful of previously unreported and underreported biographical details that Stickney claimed McVeigh hoped would remain secret, primarily those pertaining to the inner workings and dysfunctions of the McVeigh family. Perhaps the most valuable contribution made by All-American Monster is the inclusion of observations by McVeigh's friends and family members, who described his rapid physical and mental deterioration, increasingly volatile outbursts, strange conspiratorial claims, and the listless post-combat boredom he suffered after returning from the Gulf War. Stickney determined that this post-war discontent, along with his consuming outrage over the government's actions at Ruby Ridge and Waco, led him to bomb the Murrah. Stickney employed a formula commonly seen in terrorism literature in his identification and tracking of the origins and process of radicalization that lead people to commit acts of political violence. In the end, Stickney concluded that both nature and nurture were equally important to the formation of his terrorist monster, and found no single trauma or cause for his violence. Not his parents' divorce, not his failure to become an Army Ranger, nor the right-wing milieu he inhabited. Rather, Timothy McVeigh, quote, was a seemingly ordinary boy, someone who could be found in almost any average neighborhood in America, whose life is the tale of an all-American man desperately seeking a meaning to his existence and a direction, end quote. Despite the fact that neither McVeigh nor Nichols had yet to be convicted, or that the FBI investigation was ongoing, Stickney unequivocally concluded that McVeigh was indeed the primary perpetrator and that no larger conspiracy existed. Many of the factual, hypothetical, and speculative claims that appear within All-American Monster would appear in subsequently published fictional, non-fictional, journalistic, popular, and academic works about McVeigh and the bombing. Although arguably premature, Stickney's depiction of McVeigh is the first full-length book to position him as lone wolf mastermind. Professor of Criminology at India State University Mark Ham published his first book about the bombing, Apocalypse in Oklahoma, Waco and Ruby Ridge Revenged, in 1997. Released prior to McVeigh's trial and conviction, Apocalypse was the first scholarly book-length publication to advance the lone wolf theory about McVeigh's role in the bombing. Ham described the historical context of the bombing plot, employing critical social and cultural theories to introduce new perspectives about McVeigh's motivations, contributions that have informed a number of scholarly works since. In his own speculative yet well-documented chronology, Ham highlighted McVeigh, Nichols, and Fortier's association with known faces of the extreme right, but after introducing evidence to illustrate where others might have entered into the plot, rejected the notion that they did. Ham acknowledged that crucial information required to make any final determination was not as yet available, and therefore the case remained unsolved, and while existing alternate narratives involving additional perpetrators within a much larger plot ranged in complexity, the truth was much simpler. A more plausible explanation for the bombing, purported Ham, was the one endorsed and publicly advanced by McVeigh himself, that, quote, McVeigh acted as a lone wolf, and dismissed all alternate theories as a result of the public's desperate need to, quote, identify the real enemy. Ham pointed out that, while ideological similarities existed between McVeigh and the far right, the investigation failed to turn up any material evidence of the involvement of others in the bombing, and thus left politicians and the media with the choice to depict McVeigh as a terrorist and the bombing as an act of a madman, or focus on, quote, the institutions and individuals who had indirectly supported the plot. Ultimately, they chose the former. Ironically, Ham alleged that the ATF and FBI, among others, indirectly supported the bombers by acting with malfeasance in choosing to ignore critical intelligence collected about McVeigh in the years leading to the bombing, an accusation also made by others pejoratively labeled and thus dismissed as conspiracy theories. Specifically, Ham said there was evidence to show that the FBI and ATF were aware of at least some of McVeigh's suspicious activities and associations, including his links to Elohim City. In fact, Ham wrote, the FBI, ATF, or both had probably opened a file on McVeigh, but for some reasons Ham does not examine, failed to initiate a proactive investigation, and thus discover the plot and prevent the bombing. Perhaps informing Ham's intelligence failure theory, but undisclosed in Apocalypse, was his role as a paid expert consultant for McVeigh's defense team. Noteworthy, however, is that while he makes mention of the failed intelligence theory in Apocalypse, he nonetheless advances a lone wolf version of events. In Ham's 2002 book about the bombing, he expanded on the intelligence failure theory and came to a very different conclusion from that argued in Apocalypse. FBI special agents John Hersley and Larry Tongate, two lead investigators in the case, felt compelled in their 2004 book, Simple Truths, The Real Story of the Oklahoma City Bombing Investigation, to correct, quote, various inaccurate and irresponsible theories that this notorious event spawned, and, quote, tell the real story of the Oklahoma bombing. Restating their intentions throughout the book, the authors offer, quote, a much-needed factual history of the case, and Simple Truths purports to offer a, quote, contribution to accuracy in history. Tongate and Hersley summarize and advance the FBI's conclusion and the case prosecutors presented at the criminal trials of McVeigh and Nichols, and assert that, having turned over every stone and followed every lead, quote, all other theories proved implausible, and no credible evidence existed that anyone other than McVeigh and Nichols were involved. After all, they emphasize, McVeigh himself admitted such. In his introduction to the book, retired FBI agent and governor of Oklahoma at the time of the bombing, Frank Keating, described the bombing as an act of, quote, monstrous evil, but assured readers that Simple Truths, quote, is the closed book on the case. 2 evil men did this, and 2 evil men paid. Simple Truths is illustrative of the way in which the government's lone wolf story is oddly similar to McVeigh's own. Footnote: while allegations about the FBI's harassment of eyewitnesses and attempts to get them to change their stories were ignored, a recent book by former Jones Team investigator Roger Charles provides insider knowledge about Hersley's role in the harassment. Included were his extensive efforts to neutralize eyewitnesses who reported seeing others with McVeigh, quote, convince them that John Doe 2 was a phantom, and thereby prevent the spectral conspirator from appearing at the trials. In fact, Charles wrote, quote, Hersley was the prosecution's go-to person to resolve many of the holes in the case, unquote. Lead prosecutor Larry Mackey later acknowledged that Hersley regularly hammered witnesses who might aid the defense team's cases. Further, lead FBI agent Danny Deffenbaugh also disclosed that, in his opinion, Hersley commonly distorted evidence, lied about his investigation, or lack thereof, and often acted outside of his authority. Quote, we had to watch over John. He'd go around trying to stop viable investigations, especially if they involved other people in the conspiracy. Every time we caught him, I had to bring him in the woodshed and paddle him. Then he'd go right back at it, unquote. The Pack of Wolves and those closely watched. In cases of high-profile American assassinations, where one lone gunman appears, alternate accounts inevitably emerge asserting the involvement of multiple shooters and competing claims about their identities. Multiple gunmen rumored to have been involved in the assassination of John F. Kennedy include, but are not limited to, the CIA, KGB, Secret Service, Mossad, Mafia, anti-Castro Cubans, a plethora of intelligence operatives including Howard Hunt, David Ferry, the Three Tramps, Man with the Umbrella, Black Dog Man, and Lee Harvey Oswald. Likewise, in some stories about the Oklahoma City bombing, where lone wolf bomber McVeigh appears, others follow closely behind who populate a second, more thematically complex genre of narratives collectively referred to as the Pack of Wolves. Unlike the uniformity of lone wolf narratives, pack stories have distinct variations, the Pack and the Pack Closely Watched. Within all pack stories and their subvariants, McVeigh is no longer the mastermind or primary villain in the bombing plot, never acts entirely alone, and is always one of several additional unidentified and or unapprehended conspirators who helped conceive of, plan, fund, and execute the bombing. Therefore, McVeigh's culpability is mitigated, and his role usurped by others unknown. The others are composed of several individuals who, over time, have become a single composite character widely known as John Doe 2. Within the various descriptions of the pack, identities of the others unknown differ and may include a range of candidates: Islamic jihadists, the Irish Republican Army, Colombian drug lords, but most often neo-Nazi bank robbers and or others within the White Power movement. While the identities and roles of the others remain the subject of inquiry and speculation, their involvement and sometimes even their existence are officially denied. Unlike the lone wolf template, that bases its claims to truth on known information and achieves total narrative closure, the defining quality of pack stories and all other variants is the unknown, and thus an inability to achieve resolution. Pack accounts explain how, while over 226 people reported seeing one or more John Does with McVeigh in the months before the bombing, everyone who saw him in OKC the morning of the explosion saw him with these others. PAC stories also explain how the participation of these others was obscured from history by the disguises and decoy vehicles they used, generating a myriad of contradictory eyewitness descriptions of them. This confusion led to several permutations of a single conspiracy theory, all involving the officially denied others. Recurring themes and elements in stories about the pack of watched wolves include covert surveillance practices conducted mostly by the FBI and ATF, and the ongoing presence of undercover federal informants, agents, provocateurs, and spies who, throughout the plot, pose as true pack wolves, all the while passing information to their government handlers. In these stories, McVeigh becomes part of a sting operation gone horribly awry. In their failure to prevent the bombing, the government assumes a degree of culpability ranging from failure to act on intelligence, sometimes vague, sometimes detailed, and warnings of the impending bombing as well as accusations that they orchestrated it. All PAC stories allege that various government agencies have engaged in a cover-up by intentionally distorting and withholding facts about the bombing from the public. Like all other variants, PAC stories appeared publicly immediately after McVeigh's arrest and proliferated during the years leading to McVeigh's 2001 execution, often via works of investigative journalism and news reports that connected him to various players in the White Power movement and American paramilitary underground. Footnote: the most comprehensive and seminal body of book-length works detailing and advancing PAC stories are those authored by attorneys or experts who worked for McVeigh's defense team. While Mark Ham published his Lone Wolf account the previous year, McVeigh's lead defense attorney, Stephen Jones, published his PAC book, Others Unknown, Timothy McVeigh and the Oklahoma City Bombing Conspiracy, in 1998. The cover of Others Unknown promises to tell the real story, a common and familiar claim made by works of narrative variants. The title is taken from the criminal indictment against McVeigh and Nichols and encapsulates the plot of the book, i.e., Jones's quest to identify other conspirators, despite the prosecution's claims that the crime was, quote, an open and shut case, or the, quote, systematic and deliberate attempts by the government to prevent, unquote, the American people from learning the truth. The August 1995 criminal indictments asserted that Nichols and McVeigh had, quote, conspired with others unknown to bomb the Murrah. In Jones's book, readers learned that the real story is complex, shadowy, and sinister. Jones recounts at length the reasons for his unshakable doubts about the veracity of McVeigh's confessions and frustrations with his omissions and partial admissions, while simultaneously contending with ongoing FBI and DOJ refusals to produce exculpatory discovery materials. Jones wrote that, despite his client's wishes, this Kafkaesque situation left him with no other option but to retain several experts and align himself with journalists, the dissidents, and right-wing/white supremacist extremists. Although obstructed at every turn, Jones's costly, time-consuming, and controversial search for the others unknown helped uncover the earliest information pertaining to the government's prior knowledge, i.e. the ARA, Elohim City, and other White Power movement actors. Ultimately, though, Jones failed to follow through on the book cover's promise to tell the real story, by concluding that, due to both the government and McVeigh's intentional blockage and obfuscation, the case remained a mystery. Hence, Jones could not solve the case, offer a unified theory about it, or explain the failures of intelligence. Jones depicts his former client as the, quote, ghost of Lee Harvey Oswald, a man who became entangled in a much larger conspiracy that ultimately shielded everyone except himself. Jones describes McVeigh as a narcissistic, megalomaniacal patsy who, because of his craving for publicity, desired to take full credit for the bombing, but a, quote, designated patsy nonetheless. Indeed, Others Unknown reads largely as a forum for Jones to defend himself against McVeigh's public accusations that Jones violated his attorney-client confidentiality, resulting in the many confession leaks to the media. Jones's accusations that McVeigh craved publicity were ones McVeigh first leveled against Jones prior to his trial and subsequently in media interviews as well as to his biographers. Jones argues that McVeigh himself waived this confidentiality and had even encouraged Jones to write the book, all publicly denied by McVeigh. According to Jones, McVeigh's unsuccessful attempt in August 1997 to have him removed as his attorney constituted a waiver of attorney-client privilege. In March 2000, after the publication of Others Unknown, McVeigh filed a 50-page motion for a new trial, claiming that Jones provided inadequate, ineffective, and unprofessional legal representation, claiming that Jones was not motivated by a desire to defend him, but to gain celebrity and cash in on his high-profile client. Ironically, Jones's book catalyzed McVeigh's decision to cooperate in the writing of American Terrorist, the exemplary Lone Wolf text. American Terrorist and Others Unknown illustrate the differences in the plots of lone versus pack stories, as well as the complex and contradictory dynamics involved in the relationships between McVeigh, Jones, other members of the defense team, the dissidents, mainstream and independent media, and the state, FBI, DOJ, etc. Further, Others Unknown embodies the ongoing struggle between Jones and McVeigh over who would tell the story, how, when, and to whom, resulting in internal defense team contentions as well as McVeigh's ongoing and increasingly aggressive public assertions of sole responsibility. After the trial of Tim McVeigh concluded, various authors expanded upon previous PAC texts. Included was award-winning British journalist Ambrose Evans Pritchard's seminal 1997 book, The Secret Life of Bill Clinton, dedicated to, among others, the dissidents and, quote, the people of Oklahoma who deserve the truth and, quote, have refused to accept the half-truths of the Department of Justice. Pritchard describes the OKC bombing as the, quote, most tragic event in the U.S. since the JFK assassination, and one that had an immediate, quote, catalytic effect of garnering support for the expansion of anti-terrorist powers and budgets. Pritchard wrote that at stake during McVeigh's trial was not only the matter of determining his guilt or innocence, but justice itself. In his opinion, McVeigh's criminal trial, quote, did not bring out the full story, and in fact had been, quote, skillfully managed to ensure that collateral revelations were kept to a minimum. Pritchard focused on the involvement of the ARA and Elohim City and concluded that, given the number of informants who issued warnings, the bombing was most likely, quote, a sting operation that went disastrously wrong, followed by a DOJ and FBI cover-up so well executed, Pritchard, quote, could never have imagined the machinery of cover-up could be so oppressively efficient. Similarly, in his encyclopedic 1998 book, The Oklahoma City Bombing and the Politics of Terror, conspiracy genre writer David Hoffman posited two theories. Either the bombing was a sting gone wrong or a deliberate black operation. Hoffman, like many other writers, acknowledges that the truth of the bombing is unreachable, given the vast amount of missing data. Still, he concludes that the event was likely a deep-cover black operation orchestrated by powerful but faceless elites, and executed in the typical style of a tactical strategy of tension, a term that most often refers to state-sponsored terrorism described as, quote, a tactic which consists in committing bombings and attributing them to others. By the term tension, one refers to emotional tension that creates a sentiment of fear. By the term strategy, one refers to what feeds the fear of the people towards one particular group, unquote. Hoffman presents a number of depictions, all of which paint McVeigh as an Oswald type, even Riley describing the Ryder truck as, quote, the Mannlicher Carcano bomb. End footnote. The guilty agent. In the fourth variation, McVeigh is depicted not as a lone wolf or even one within a pack of wolves, but as a guilty agent, a witting undercover operative for shadowy defense agencies in a nationwide sting operation which, for one reason or another, resulted in the bombing. Guilty agent stories appeared frequently in works of the conspiracy theory genre prior to the criminal trials of McVeigh and Nichols. For example, John Rappaport's 1995 book, Oklahoma City Bombing, The Suppressed Truth, argues that the bombing plot was unquestionably a conspiracy that subsequently led to a cover-up afterwards. While Rappaport acknowledged that at the time of his writing many of the details of this conspiracy and cover-up remained unknown, he nonetheless asserted that both were part of a larger effort by the federal government to run damage control in the aftermath of the Waco debacle, demonize the Patriot movement, and pass anti-terrorism legislation which would expand the budgets and powers of various government agencies, thereby allowing them to further suppress the movement. Rather than espousing a unified theory about the exact workings and details involved in the bombing plot, Rappaport presented several scenarios other than the then-dominant lone wolf story. Rappaport asserted that if any of the alternate scenarios outlined proved true, it was likely that McVeigh had not been fully aware of all the details of the plot he was involved in, but was more likely an amateur participant within, quote, the visible part of a larger sophisticated operation, a delivery man, blamable man, fall guy, throwaway, and dupe. After McVeigh's arrest, so-called conspiracy theorists were linked to terrorism. This new batch of potential terrorists and their supporters co-opted the discourse of counterterrorism pundits by claiming that the bombing itself was the result of a conspiracy, and while the exact nature of this conspiracy was not yet known, they believed that covert state actors played a part in the carnage. In the years after McVeigh's trial and execution, guilty agent depictions of McVeigh have continued to proliferate online and in self-published books. Footnote. On April 25, 1995, only days after McVeigh's arrest and perp walk, the front page of the San Francisco Chronicle announced, quote, militias feed on conspiracy theories, bombing called government plot to create hysteria. The article portrayed the McVeigh variety of conspiracy theorists as tinfoil hat-wearing pathological political paranoiacs who saw, quote, mysterious black helicopters everywhere they looked. For them, the bombing was part of an attempt by the U.S. government to undermine the U.S. Constitution and implement a New World Order. Worse, their beliefs had them actively, quote, preparing for war with government troops and police. Several other initial news articles in major outlets contained quotes by militia spokespeople who claimed that McVeigh was probably just an Oswald-like patsy set up to vilify and demonize the growing Patriot movement, alleging that the government itself was knowingly responsible for the bombing and that McVeigh had acted as their willing puppet. They included McVeigh's, quote, fellow patriots, members of weekend militias, and, of course, conspiracy theorists, who continued to vocalize their insistence that McVeigh was simply a convenient stooge masking the faces of the real perpetrators. John Trochman, a well-known voice within the Patriot movement, leader of the Montana militia and now known government informant, told reporters McVeigh was a victim of the, quote, Oswald syndrome, a patsy, whose sole function was to, quote, provide deep cover for the CIA, after all. Trochman asked, quote, who trained him? The military. For conspiracy theorists like Trochman, the real story was easy to suppress because, quote, the American people have been so brainwashed they can't see the truth anymore, end quote. In addition to the above-mentioned quotes, guilty agent stories appeared frequently in works of the conspiracy theory genre prior to the criminal trials of McVeigh and Nichols. For example, John Rappaport's 1995 book, Oklahoma City Bombing, The Suppressed Truth, whose cover claims to be the book that shatters the cover-up, argues that the bombing plot was unquestionably a conspiracy that subsequently led to a cover-up. While Rappaport acknowledged that at the time of his writing many of the details of this conspiracy and cover-up remained unknown, he nonetheless asserted that both were part of a larger effort by the federal government to run damage control in the aftermath of the Waco debacle, demonize the Patriot movement, and pass anti-terrorism legislation which would expand the budgets and powers of various government agencies, thereby allowing them to further suppress the movement. Similarly, Jim Keith's 1996 book, OK Bomb, Conspiracy and Cover-Up, listed the numerous unaccounted for sightings of John Doe 2, 11, quote, striking incongruities in the behavior of Timothy McVeigh not accounted for by the official story, and outlined evidence suggesting the government's prior knowledge of the bombing. While Keith did not argue in favor of any one of them, he proposed various conspiracy theories as possibilities to account for inconsistencies in the Lone Wolf story. End footnote. In this book, I discuss new information which has surfaced since 2001 and introduce new evidence to show how guilty agent theories are originally rooted in stories told by McVeigh himself, both prior to and after the bombing, and how stories such as these may be more plausible than previously imagined. The Experimental Wolf. Finally, experimental wolf narratives break with many previous understandings of the bombing story and the life of Timothy McVeigh, and often disrupt linearity and agency normally ascribed to him. In them, McVeigh, the ultimate conspiracy theorist, is rendered the victim of a conspiracy, a dupe, a guilty agent lacking real agency, a traumatized automaton suffering from agency panic, the sense of being shaped or controlled by powerful external forces, and sometimes Generation X's own Manchurian candidate. Footnote. An in-depth discussion of agency panic is found in Timothy Melly, Empire of Conspiracy, The Culture of Paranoia in Post-War America, Cornell University Press, Ithaca, New York, 2000. End footnote. Within many of these theories, either during or after his time in the Army, McVeigh was a test subject for classified experimental or refined procedures until after his arrest. McVeigh is thus depicted as a human guinea pig who, unbeknownst even to himself, depending on the version articulated, is influenced, tracked, or controlled by a number of mysterious technologies, drugs, and methods, manipulated by mad scientists operating out of black-budgeted staging grounds in a number of geographical locations. Recurring themes and elements may include high-level, officially sanctioned architects of death, brainwashed automatons, and from time to time UFOs. A close reading of previous experimental-type texts reveals a wide range of emergent literary and cultural themes found in works of science fiction, but that originate from or reflect actual historical and current circumstances, events, and practices. We will outline and compare various interpretations of all experimental-type stories about McVeigh or others, and explore related themes and texts and the many variations of experimental-type narratives, including those about post-traumatic stress disorder, Gulf War syndrome, and the most common of these, brainwashing/mind control. We will closely examine stories told by and about McVeigh, and/or fictional ones similar to those that appeared and circulated immediately after his arrest. For instance, within days, countless news articles reported that McVeigh told a number of people he believed the Army embedded a computer chip in his buttocks. Very quickly, the reports noted, the black helicopter crowd suggested that he was the victim of mind control experiments. Many variations of experimental-type stories appeared online and in book-length works prior to McVeigh's execution. More recently, they have appeared in fictional works, like Tracy Lett's 2006 play Bug, and its 2007 film adaptation of the same name, as well as a January 2010 episode of Conspiracy Theory with Jesse Ventura, entitled Manchurian Candidate. Though no proponent of the experimental variation has yet tested these consequently unsubstantiated claims against oral and archival records, in this book I reveal a number of obscure and startling contextual and biographical details about McVeigh. In constructing this experimental-type history, I employ both fictional and non-fictional texts, including those about McVeigh, and update readers on recent controversial and provocative bioethical issues surrounding, among other practices, the use of non-lethal interrogation, surveillance, and soldier enhancement methods. Like all others discussed thus far, McVeigh first articulated various contradictory versions of these stories privately prior to the bombing, and many appeared publicly within days of his arrest. While acknowledging the existence of others unknown and multiple John Does, experimental-type stories emphasize McVeigh's powerlessness over his own actions, making his final statement, "I am the master of my fate, the captain of my soul," rather ironic. Perhaps one valuable contribution made by this writing is the demonstration of an underlying medical and psychological narrative that, while largely unknown, underpins a number of fictional and non-fictional representations of McVeigh. This hidden narrative sheds light on, or helps clarify, unknown or unresolved biographical elements of McVeigh's life, controversies surrounding the Gulf War, and contributes to a number of larger ongoing discussions and debates surrounding current U.S. government, military, and medical policies and practices. We will also explore a nearly hidden history of McVeigh's participation and experiences in the Gulf War. All experimental type stories or variations thereof are important no matter their truth or the actual secrets they reveal, as within all subcategories, inscribed within McVeigh's very body, symbolically or actually, are the effects of militarism and warfare. Mind control, or experimental, stories help us to understand possible motives left unexplored about McVeigh's motivation to participate in the bombing plot, whether as a lone wolf, as part of a pack, or